So thanks, Yara, for the introduction. Today we'll be talking about current trends and best practices for evaluating generative AI use cases in healthcare. It's quite the mouthful, but I'm hoping that you'll learn some very practical tips and probably things you may not have heard in other talks. And I'll show you some, I think, very compelling examples of the type of work that we're doing and how we're thinking about evaluating Gen AI use cases. So the goals for today will be to talk about, what makes evaluating generative AI difficult, what makes it different than evaluating other types of systems, and then what are the ways in which evaluating generative AI is kind of the same as evaluating any sort of healthcare solution. And then we'll dive into some very specific techniques on ways that experts are thinking about evaluation. And then we'll end with some examples. I think that's the best way to really drive home the point of both how difficult it can be, how to set up systems around it, and why those can be useful. So as of today in 2025, I would say the majority of Gen AI use cases in healthcare are actually just large language models. So although generative AI encompasses more than, for example, image generation and things of that nature, the vast majority of things, both in pilot and in production, involve large language models. For example, if you look at revenue cycle management, generative AI technologies, or ambient scribing, or generating clinical summaries, and so on and so forth, all of the major use cases thus far have involved LLM technology. And the reason why generative AI use cases are so difficult to evaluate are because LLMs themselves are difficult to evaluate. There are many aspects of this, the first being that LLMs generate unstructured text and language responses, which are difficult to work with. They are inherently random, although there's work being done to try to solve some of these. The models are changing all the time. If you keep up with what the frontier models are, you'll see that every few weeks, the leaderboards sort of change and new models get released, and it's very difficult to keep up with. And then a very major point is that the models that are used by most vendors these days are hidden behind third-party interfaces, meaning that it's not like your health system or your hospital controls the compute on which these large language models run, which introduces a layer of abstraction that is difficult to work with sometimes. So I'll show some examples. So the first of these difficulties is that it's actually difficult to get large language models to produce the same result every time. There is I would call a seminal work that was released maybe 2 weeks ago by a company called ThinkingMachines.ai, which is a spinoff of OpenAI. And they released this very in-depth technical article on why it's so difficult to get the same output from the same prompt in the same large language model each time. You might think that this should be somewhat straightforward. And if you've played around with the technical portions at all, you'll know that there's this concept known as temperature. And in theory, if you reduce that temperature to 0, it should always select the most likely next word when it's generating text. But it turns out that even this is not enough to produce deterministic results. And so this paper or this article showed that it involves even things down to the hardware level, where you have floating point additions in the computer code that make it difficult to be deterministic. And in addition, the order in which you batch process these prompts also changes the output. And so it's very, very difficult, I would say almost impossible if you're at the user layer to control deterministically what comes out of these systems. And so that's an inherent difficulty with their evaluation. What it implies for evaluation, though, is that it's best practice to do the same evaluation multiple times so you can generate error bars. So you can kind of get a sense for what is the lower bound and upper bound, or for example, putting an empirical confidence interval around it. How well are you actually completing the task of interest? And it might change from moment to moment, and that's very difficult as well. To highlight this, I'll give a brief anecdote. So when OpenAI released their open source model, this was the same open source model that was provided by all sorts of different model providers, we'll call them. So things like Microsoft Azure or Google or Amazon Web Services, they provide application programmer interfaces or APIs where you can make calls and send your prompts there, and they'll return the answer back to you. And these are all, let's see, maybe 10 or so providers on the x-axis here. And on the y-axis, you have performance on a particular mathematics benchmark. And you'll see two things. The first is that each of them have error bars, and they're different sizes. And also they have different sort of average performance or median performance. And so for the same exact model, You can have catastrophic errors, for example, in compactful AI or whatever this company is. But even things like well-established companies like Microsoft Azure have a median performance of 80% on this benchmark, whereas some of the newer providers have 93%. Keep in mind, this is the exact same model, the exact same weights being used, and the exact same prompts. And yet we see that for different providers, you might get different responses and different performance. So this makes it very difficult to evaluate some of these tools. 5 days after this was published by Artificial Analysis, many of them in light of this information, improved their performance. They fixed some critical bugs. They changed some weights. You can see that now Google is entering because they didn't have a version of it in the initial use case, but now they're up to 83%, for instance. Still not quite as high as where they should be. And again, these are all the same models, just served by different providers. There's also been recent reports of Anthropic, for example, the creators of Claude AI, of having very, very complicated infrastructure-related bugs that led to degradations in performance. This has been an ongoing hot topic within sort of the GPU and infrastructure industries, saying, even large companies like Anthropic, which serve billions of users, have issues with making sure that their outputs are deterministic or that their performance doesn't degrade. And so this is an ongoing problem that spans far more than just healthcare, but it's just another layer of why it's difficult to evaluate these solutions, because you have to go all the way down to this layer to see where the non-determinism comes from. Not to mention, if you've been keeping track, the models change all the time. So for different capabilities such as coding, for summarization, mathematics, general reasoning, the leaders in this space change all the time. And so you have open Chinese companies. And if you look at the pace of evolution within these models, they keep getting better and better, but the rate of release hasn't slowed down at all. It's just constantly we're being inundated with new models, which can also be difficult because as soon as you evaluate your use case using one model, another model might come out. And the question is, do you have to reevaluate? Is it worth switching? And so on and so forth. So essentially, the point of all of this is to say that there are uncontrollable sources of variation throughout the large language model stack. There's inherent randomness in the models themselves. The models are changing. You have black box APIs. And no matter what your solution is, it's very difficult to guarantee stability. So just because your model and your solution works one day doesn't mean that 3 months from now, and certainly not 6 months to a year from now, will work the same. And one of the critical issues is this is not just a healthcare system issue or a hospital issue. The vendors that health systems work with also have these issues. And you can bet that they are also doing this type of work where they're evaluating their own systems, they're evaluating the underlying models. And so essentially this iceberg on the right, it's evals all the way down. So there's solution evaluations, vendor evaluations, API evaluations, and then large language model evaluations. And all of these play a role in designing systems that are robust and effective. So in order to combat some of these variations, there are some techniques, like I mentioned, it's important to evaluate the task multiple times to establish error bars. Just because you evaluate it once and you get a really good score does not mean that in practice, your solution is going to continue to work that well. And this goes for if you're evaluating a vendor, if you're evaluating a homegrown solution, it's important to do it multiple times. Another interesting emerging paradigm is to evaluate on request to make sure that no model degradation is present. So as I showed before, companies like Anthropic and others have had outages in the past or sneaky bugs in their code that get introduced due to the rapid pace of evolution in this space. And all of a sudden, a particular model might stop performing as well as you're used to. If you use these APIs quite a bit, you might even notice that yourself, that sometimes it seems maybe not as smart as other times. Part of this is due to randomness, part of it is due to model routing, but sometimes it's just due to bugs. And so if you're trying to do something, sometimes it's important to send an evaluation request right before, again, against a known answer, just to make sure that it continues to work. And quite importantly, and something that we see all the time is whenever your model or a version of the API or anything about the environment changes, it's important to at least run some sort of evaluation just to make sure that nothing has actually changed. Another sort of key component of this is to differentiate between what are called like task-specific metrics and then impact metrics. So if we use an example, for example, of a structured chart summarization, which is sort of a general, large language model enabled solution, you have a whole bunch of patient information. You want to create a structured summary from it. Let's say we were designing a system like this. Some of the task-specific evaluations or questions that we might ask are, for example, how well do the large language models actually summarize the patient's chart? Does the model make mistakes? Is the information that's provided relevant? Does it match what our existing gold standard looks like? And you can imagine many more, right? Does the summarization have any sort of bias? Does it work well equally across different languages? There are so many questions that you can ask specifically about the task of doing chart summarization. But notably, that is different from evaluating whether that actually has an impact. And so even if you can guarantee that this summarization, for example, is correct or it's accurate or so on and so forth, does not mean that the summarization actually saves people time or that your end users are actually going to use it. Whether it reduces cognitive load on providers or clinical staff or whomever is actually using the application. And this portion is really no different than evaluating any other solution in healthcare, right? So this is sort of agnostic to the fact that we're using generative AI to create these tools, and more just in general about understanding that if you don't define measurable impact goals, then you can get stuck in sort of a pilot cycle where you're just constantly piloting. There are no clear endpoints as to when you should transition from a pilot into a more mature product. And we see this all the time. This is a very, very common thing that occurs. So far I've talked a little bit about, high level, like why it's important to do LM evals, why they're difficult. I want to give you a flavor of a little bit about, what techniques we can actually use for this. So I would say that the most important technique for LLM evaluation and, generative AI solution evaluation is the creation of gold standard data sets. This is the key. If you leave with anything today, I would leave with the fact that this is still the most important thing that you can do. And so we'll use another example that we've seen in-house, which is, let's say you're developing something for, prior authorization, which asks questions like, was the specific procedure that we're interested in documented? Was there a surgical plan that was documented? Was there a presence of physical therapy? Were steroids injected? There are a whole host of questions which are asked for prior authorization problems. And instead of just evaluating kind of at a glance or showing a few examples, it's very important to create a comprehensive data set that has the correct answer for all of these things so that you can reliably and effectively evaluate your large language model solutions and not rely on sort of heuristics or maybe glancing at a few or trying one or two patients in an unstructured way. There are many reasons for this, which I'll get into, but just to illustrate how important this is, there are many companies which just do this and are worth billions of dollars. So companies like Scale AI, which was recently acquired by Meta, Revelo, Mercor, a lot of these AI firms all sell human annotation gold standard data set creation as a service, and they're worth billions of dollars because this is truly the secret sauce in making sure that large language models are trained correctly. And very much the same goes for evaluating end user use cases. There's only one way to really tell whether it works, and is to create a broad data set on which to evaluate on. Now, creating a gold standard data set is not as simple as just handpicking a few examples and saying, okay, this is the example that I want to label, and if it gets this correct, I'm assuming it gets it correct for all of my downstream use cases. And so some of the things that we've found to be very important in this is that you want to include negative examples as well as positive examples. Meaning if for this instance, I'm trying to create a solution for prior authorization, I'm not just going to include patients who met prior authorization and had yes to all the answers. I want to include a few or perhaps many who did not meet prior authorization. And the reason for that is because if you don't include the full distribution of potential patients that the large language model will work with, or the Gen AI solution will work with, then you won't really have an idea of whether it only works in the easy case or whether it only works in the affirmative case rather than the negative case. We've also found that it's important to pick a variety, for example, of easy ones where the information is right up front in a note, for example, medium where they're spread across a few notes, or hard cases where you could have hundreds or thousands of notes that are all scattered across the record. Is it possible to even create a prior authorization for these types of patients? And so the idea is that you don't want to include only cases where the data is very obvious. And ultimately, if you take a step back at these, anecdotal examples of what works, the idea is, again, to create a representative data set. Now, one thing that we've also come across, which we think is quite nice, is as you notice that your model is making mistakes, of course, you can correct them on your data set, although you have to be careful not to craft prompts that are too specific and only working for that specific data set. So it's important to change this data set over time and add things as you notice, for example, mistakes that you feel you want to double check, or if you notice that there's an increase in variation in the types of things that you're feeding these Gen AI solutions. So in this case, for the prior authorization, for example, if you're going to try and expand to a new clinic and they have different notes or different providers that write their notes differently or different templates, it's important to include some of those back into this gold standard data set. At the end of the day, it's all about trying to capture the variation that you'll see in the real world and trying to create a representative set so that when you evaluate, you're not just evaluating the sort of the easy cases. Another tip that we found to be quite useful, and this is more of a property of large language models and their APIs, is that you should try to prefer structured responses when you can. So instead of comparing textual answers to other textual answers, it's helpful to structure your evaluations as, for example, true, false, or to possibly constrain the values so that it makes them easier to compare deterministically. So for instance, let's say we have this question here, which is, whether a specific procedure was documented. You might see it come in various forms. In fact, your gold standard might have it as, a specific medical term, but then there might be a synonym in the other one. And it becomes kind of difficult. Some people even use a third or another large language model to do this textual comparison. But as we mentioned before, the more non-determinism you add, the less reliable the system will be. And so there are ways to ask for structured responses from these large language models now. And it's easier if you constrain them into, for example, true, false. For example, was a gallbladder surgery of any sort documented? And then the large language model can just output true or false. You can sort of constrain it. If you're comparing dates for things, you can provide a grammar for them to make sure they're always in the right format. This is sort of a general practice that when we work with large language models, we try to implement those. Of course, not all things can be structured like that, right? And so, something that comes up quite often is like, how do you evaluate how good a medical summary is? And it's very difficult to say, oh, is this summary good, true or false? That's probably not a very useful evaluation to have. And so in the meantime, what people do is that the gold standard is still, again, having humans in the loop to evaluate it, but coming up with a very structured rubric, and then have experts assess whether that rubric is useful. But at the end of the day, there's really no substitute for having a human in the loop to really do your evaluation. And part of, one of the reasons why that is that humans are sensitive to things like style and other components of a generated answer that large language models may not be sensitive to. I think it's very tempting to have large language models evaluate themselves, and we'll talk much more about that paradigm in the coming minutes. But ultimately, having a human in the loop is very important. And to sort of illustrate how good humans are at and how sensitive they are to specific style things, when OpenAI released, they deprecated GPT-4o, which was an older version of the model, in favor of GPT-5. There was a huge outcry among dedicated ChatGPT users. There were, users who were using it to, for example, have certain personas to help them through difficult times. There are reports of people being in romantic relationships with these models, which is totally new, like emerging paradigm. And so you can imagine that if all of a sudden the model provider shuts down a certain version of the model and a new one emerges with a different quote unquote personality, that can leave people a little bit, they feel like that's maybe a problem. And so, for example, when this happened, you can see reports of people saying they were really frustrated and they got really sad, and even leaving dramatic remarks like GPT-5 is wearing the skin of my dead friend. Okay, so this is how sensitive humans can be to, to the stylistic differences in large language models. Whereas on most benchmarks, structured benchmarks, GPT-5 vastly outperforms GPT-4o. So at the end of the day, although humans are the gold standard for evaluating these tools, it does remain kind of infeasible to have humans constantly evaluating the outputs. You don't have dedicated staff to be constantly checking all of the different Gen AI services that, for example, a health system or department is using. And so there is quite a large field of evaluations known as large language model as judge. And the key thing that I want to note about this, and I'll show some examples, is that they are not a replacement for human evals, like I mentioned earlier. They are good for giving a rough sense for how well certain tasks are being completed, and they are a very active research area. And so rather than using them as a be all end all, judge of quality, what we could say is, well, we can use a large language model to automatically detect whether there's been a large drop in quality, and then we can forward that, if there is, to maybe some human users who are more dedicated to look at the actual outputs. And the main idea of LLM as judge is exactly what it sounds like, which is that we use large language models to judge the outputs of other large language models. Now, again, if you've been sort of paying attention, like these are unreliable now in multiple steps. Not only is the answer generation unreliable, but now you have this other judge on top of it, which has non-deterministic properties. And so we've seen some examples, for example, that large language models from the same family, meaning if they're both from the same company, tend to prefer their own outputs. And so sometimes it's reasonable to use a model from a different provider or a different family of model to act as a critic or judge for the other one. So there's been some well-documented research showing basically because their training data sets look similar, that they tend to prefer outputs from their own model class. So I'm just going to give a small smattering of large language model as judge techniques. These are not be all end all. There's actually a vast literature on this that are much more complicated than what I'm showing. But just to give you a flavor of some of the techniques that people use. And so an example of a bad or a very vague summary or evaluation task would be, evaluate this summary for completeness out of 10. Now obviously, this is a little bit of a contrived example. I don't think people would do this, but it's important to break down steps for these large language models to follow in doing evaluation. And so on the right, you might have an example where you need to, step one, make sure you verify the core patient information. Step two, evaluate the clinical components. And so breaking down the evaluation task into a series of steps is often much better than just asking it for a raw score. Similarly, not only is it important to break down the evaluation procedure into a series of steps, it's also important to decompose evaluation criteria into steps as well. And so when we ask for things like completeness or accuracy or faithfulness or terseness, these are things that, although the large language model, quote unquote, understands, it's going to be more reliable if we provide a series of steps that break down the criteria as well. You can think of this as just creating a rubric, a very detailed rubric on how you would grade, for example, another human's writing or generated output on the same task. So if you're, for example, trying to make sure the medication is accurate, you should also make sure that, completeness means, or accuracy means that it's the correct drug name, it's spelled correctly, is it consistently using the generic or brand name, and so on and so forth. So breaking down both the criteria and the actual evaluation steps themselves is a good way to sort of ground these large language models into performing the correct task. Another very common technique is to include other examples of this procedure in the prompt or in the evaluation itself. For example, if you have other examples that are human graded, you can actually use that as a reference for the large language model. And so here's kind of like a rough scaffold of what this might look like. You could say, here's an example, and you can have some text about the medication. That was a summary. And then you have the reasoning for the evaluation. So the human might say, okay, the reason why I scored this as 7 out of 10 is because, it does validate the right patient in the right context, but it adds some irrelevant information about X, Y, and Z. And so you actually provide that reasoning of how you went through the rubric to the large language model, and then you ask it and then you say, here's the score that I gave, and then it tries to emulate that behavior for further evaluations. This is related to the topic we previously discussed, which was creating a gold standard summary, because these two are well aligned. When you create your gold standard data sets, and you have reasonings for why you grade them certain ways or why they're correct, you can then put those into the LLM as examples during this evaluation phase. Another property of large language models, which people have been sort of using for LLM evaluation, is that they tend to be pretty good at picking between two examples and saying, hey, this one is better than this other one for whatever reason, rather than providing a numerical score. And I would argue that this is very similar to if you ask somebody to sit down and say, hey, can you rate this out of 10? That's a little bit difficult because everybody's, sense of, 1 through 10 is different. Are people looking at it like a linear scale or perhaps like a normal distribution and so on and so forth? So everybody has a different idea of what out of 10 means, but it's much easier to just format it as a series of picking between a good example and a bad example. So let's say I had, 10 summaries that were generated, and then I manually adjudicated them and said that, I had one for each score out of 10. Right. What I could do is I could just iteratively provide them and say, compare the generated response with an example that I scored a 1, which one is better? And then do the same for 2 and for 3 and so on and so forth. And then maybe take an aggregate over, doing this several times to come up with some sort of average score. This would be, I think, a quite reasonable approach to using an LLM as judge. At the end of the day, though, this is still more of an art form. Even though there's a lot of research that goes into this field, as I mentioned before, it's very difficult to come up with one best solution or even a series of best practices because as the models change, the optimal techniques for prompting them and so on and so forth, it's a quite difficult problem. And essentially, there's effectively no way for us to know what the best prompt for a given task is. A lot of it is still art. And there are increasingly a number of like prompt optimizers that people are doing research on. But generally speaking, it's very difficult to know, the impacts of, model changes and so on and so forth on both the output and the judgment itself. So this is mostly just used as a heuristic. It has a lot of fragility in the way that the current approaches work. And so primarily the way that we've been thinking about them is they're good to get a rough sense to see if the quality of an overall output has changed. And then if it actually has changed significantly and you can provide some sort of score threshold or average score or standard deviation of score, you can provide, all sorts of heuristics for what we constitute a meaningful change. And then you can justify further human evaluation or even developer intervention at that point. So those were, briefly I talked about, LLM as judge and how we evaluate these solutions. But I think what I also want to show are some compelling examples of how modern generative AI solutions in healthcare are actually being evaluated. And so this is more on the technical side of things. I did hope that you learned something there, but now I want to show, okay, in practice, how do people actually do this? And so I think a great example of this is when Kaiser went and evaluated the ambient scribe, their implementation of ambient scribes. I think this was about a year ago. Great paper from New England Journal, Callis. I highly recommend you read it. And so one of the first things they did, or one of the first questions you might have is, okay, the ambient scribe, what does it do? It produces some output, which is a note that documents what happened during the visit, for example. And so if we think back to, the principles that we talked about earlier, one of the most important things would be to come up with a human evaluation or a gold standard or a rubric for these things. And that's exactly what they did. And so they took an existing physician document quality instrument, which was already used as a rubric for judging how well people would write their clinical summaries of clinical encounters, for example. And they added a few sections that were specific to artificial intelligence. So they kept most of it the same. And this is your gold standard, your description of the ideal note. Is it accurate? Is it thorough? And so on and so forth. Is it free from hallucination? Is it free from bias? These are some additions that were included because it's a generated summary. And if you look at the paper, basically they did a human evaluation. So the authors of the paper adjudicated a random sample of 35 of each of these notes that was generated by this ambient scribing. And I think there were actually like thousands that were generated, but they handpicked like 35 examples for each of the common specialties and then evaluated those manually. And so this is still the gold standard, but you can see here that you can already see the effects of having the burden. They only did this for, let's say, the common, they did this for common themes within each specialty, and they only picked a small sample. And so, if you're using a large language model as judge, you would be able to get almost full coverage. You could probably evaluate all 1,000 of these but again, you incur that reliability cost and so on and so forth. And so they actually created a very structured example of, what exactly does good large language model or Gen AI solution look like? And they created a nice radial diagram of exactly where it was useful and where it wasn't. In addition to that, so this is just the quality of the AI summary. They also looked at impact metrics. So we talked about before that this is just looking at the accuracy and so on and so forth of the generated output. What they also cared about was, well, does this actually impact physicians who are using these tools? And so they basically surveyed physicians saying, how did you spend less pajama time or time on unscheduled days or time outside of scheduled hours? And you can see that for primary care physicians spent in the EHR related activities, there weren't huge gains. The error bars, if they cross over 0, means not statistically significant, but there was less time spent outside of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. But you can note that this is a complete different axis of evaluation than whether the AI summaries that were generated were actually effective, right? So ultimately, what we care about is not only accuracy of these things, but how does it impact downstream users? When you look at during the appointment itself, there was a significant decrease in the amount of time that was actually spent in the notes during the appointment, which I think makes sense because the whole idea is that the scribe writes the note for you, right? And so these are very important views of these applications to show not only are they accurate in terms of their discrete output, but they actually impact clinical care. Similarly, there was some follow-on work that was done at Mass General and at Emory to basically further try to prove whether ambient documentation led to decrease in burden and burnout, and they include a very large free text survey, right? And almost didn't even look at how accurate was the Gen AI solution itself, but cared more about does this actually reduce burden for our providers? Because ultimately, even if it produces a very accurate note, but then doesn't have the intended effect on reducing burnout or documentation bloat and so on and so forth, then then it's just a technical exercise and not really that important. So I want to end by spending some time talking about stuff that we're doing at the Duke Institute for Health Innovation. So you've seen some examples already of things that we've done looking at automated prior authorization notes. For example, we evaluate clinical notes written by medical students to see where they can improve. So you can imagine a lot of the techniques that we discussed in today's talk could be used there as well. We look at handoffs for note generation between shifts. So, what happened to all the patients on shift today? How can we create a summary that is both comprehensive as well as only includes the relevant information? And how do we do that? So we're applying all these techniques to many, many different projects. And I want to show one in depth in particular so that you can leave with a sense of, how we put all of these concepts together. And so we recently released a tool that we developed called Scout. And it's an EHR search and synthesis tool. And in part of developing this tool, I want to show you what it does, but also want you to think about what are the difficulties that arise when using these technologies and how we evaluate them. And we'll show some of what we're doing there. So if you give me 1 second, I will go ahead and share. One second. Okay, can you all still see my screen? I think I can see it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so like I mentioned, Scout it's an EHR search and synthesis tool that we developed in-house here at the Duke Institute for Health Innovation. And the idea basically is that it can take free text prompts. You can think of it like ChatGPT or other large language models, and you can ask questions about the electronic health record. For example, can you look over all the patient's notes and their diagnostic imaging reports and their pathology reports, and then structure it in some way that that I prefer. And so what Scout does, the system that we've developed goes, it looks through the entirety of a patient's medical record, identifies relevant information from each of these unstructured data elements, and then pulls out the relevant ones, and then uses that to answer your question. And the nice part about it is that you can do a lot of different things with the downstream information. For example, if you have a note template that you want to fill out, you can fill that out. You can create a table of a patient's treatments over time, or even populate things like registry forms and so on and so forth. So it's a very general purpose tool. So I actually want to show what it looks like. Sure. You all can still see the screen, right? Just double checking.
Yes.
Okay, so here I'm going to enter a demo patient. And so what we see here basically is you'll see the main page of Scout. Here in the text box below is where you can ask questions about a particular patient. I've just put a mock patient up. Obviously, this isn't connected to any PHI. It is at Duke, but obviously not for this demo. And so you can see here that you can query, for example, the entire history of a patient. For example, all the encounters they've ever had. You can add supporting documentation like scanned charts or note templates or lab reports and so on and so forth. And then we have a whole series of prompts which we've seeded the tool with. So you can do things like create summaries or review medication history for the patient or ask any open-ended questions that you might have. And so, for example, if I wanted to do this comprehensive medical history, I could go ahead and click that. And it just generates a prompt that says, create a summary of the patient's history, including their medical history, surgical history, family history, and so on and so forth. And so we can go ahead and send that off. One of the difficulties of developing a tool like this and evaluating it, as you might imagine, is that this is a very unstructured task, right? There are so many different things that you can use with this tool where you just ask, random questions and synthesize it in a specific format. There's a quick question to add. Does this include scanned documents? You can upload any scanned documents you want. So for example, we use this for outside hospital transfers when you have like scanned charts from other hospitals that are not able to be searched. This can search through those. I'm happy to talk through a whole bunch of other details, offline as well. So you can see here that it generated a summary exactly in the format that we asked, with a past medical history, surgical history, family history, and so on and so forth. So I want to point out a few things here. The first is that, as we just mentioned, the large language models can be unreliable. There's a lot of non-determinism. And so one of the ways best practices to try to prevent this is to make sure that all the claims made by these systems are actually backed up by evidence. And so you can see here that there are links to the specific note and the section of the note that was generated in the answer. And then we have all sorts of different things you can do with this. I'm not going to show all of them, but you can, for example, like save this for your records, and so on and so forth with references. And so this is a tool that we've developed internally at Duke. But one of the challenges that you might have with a system that's this broad, right? If we go ahead and clear the history and we look at all the capabilities that this has, and this is just a smattering. I mean, really, we're working with our physicians to figure out all the different applications of these technologies. It's extremely difficult to evaluate, right? How would you think about evaluating a general system like this, where it's not just one discrete output, but any number of discrete outputs, right? And so that's sort of the main challenge. And so here's what we're doing. So here we go. And so here's how we're thinking about evaluation for this. And this is an ongoing study that we recently got IRB approval for. It's been a lot of work in the past few months on both developing the tool and developing the statistical analysis plan and so on and so forth. So I'm quite in the weeds here, but the way that we're thinking about how to study this is that there's two portions here. One, which is, there's the impact itself, which is, okay, does it actually save people time? Does it decrease their cognitive load? And so on and so forth. And so we have one arm of the study where we allow people to use it in their general day-to-day work. And then we ask survey questions about how much time do you think it saved you? How much value is it providing? And so on and so forth. But then there's this other section of how do we check whether these discrete elements that are being generated are actually correct. So yes, you can click through the evidence and see what notes it came from, but that doesn't mean that it's 100% correct. And so what we're doing is we designed a crossover trial where participants actually use the tool for structured cases across a variety of specialties and a variety of tasks. So you can imagine some of these tasks being things like, assessing, getting a patient ready for a molecular tumor board meeting, or pre-charting on a patient that you haven't seen in the past year. What are their updates? All sorts of different clinical administrative tasks. And then we do a crossover trial where some people get access to the tool first, and then they get access, or they don't get access later, and vice versa. And after each time they complete one of these structured tasks, we measure, for example, how long it took, their accuracy, and their cognitive load, and so on and so forth. So each participant completes many, many of these patient cases. And then we have expert adjudicators actually with a standardized rubric that has detailed instructions and the gold standard answers actually go through and evaluate manually each one of the ones that were completed by the participants, right? And so those principles that I talked about, where you want to create a gold standard data set, you want human evaluation, we're doing the exact same thing here. So just to show, like, we're not just talking about it, this is actually what we're doing. We have these gold standards that we're generating with the expert physicians, coming up with a standardized rubric. And then once we've done that, so of course, using all that information, we can then say, here's how accurate the tool is, here's how much time it saves, so on and so forth. But one of the key things is we can then use that as a feedback mechanism and have that become the gold standard regression test that we then use large language models as judged to evaluate on an ongoing basis. And so the idea is that now that we've curated this very dense set of tasks done by multiple people with different gold standards and different rubrics, we now have what we consider a gold data set test suite. And in software engineering, we call that a regression test suite, right? So as things fail, or we can go ahead and add more examples to the system, and we can run this suite of examples whenever we need to show that the system continues to work. If we make any architectural decisions or changes, if we switch out the model provider, we now have this gold standard set, which we've used both to evaluate the impact as well as we can evaluate the solution in an ongoing manner. So I'll end with this, and then I'll answer a few questions that came up in chat. But I think maybe a lot of you have seen that 95% of generative AI pilots fail to show ROI. This is a recent MIT study. I think there were a lot of methodological choices that were made that this is maybe like a sensationalized headline. But this is a very real thing here, which is there exists a pilot to production chasm, which is a lot of these tools look very impressive in their pilot phase. But then how do we move from that pilot into a successful implementation? And I would argue that evaluation of these tools is the main reason. We need to have very clear impact goals that we're shooting for. We need to demonstrate these systems are reliable and that they continue to be reliable over time. So focusing on LM evaluations, we can provide safer, more reliable systems. Just evaluating the LMs themselves is not a replacement for the impact evaluation. That's sort of the key thing here to move from pilot to production. And there are a lot of emerging techniques and best practices. This is an ever-evolving field. Every week, something new comes out. And it's important to be quick on your feet and adapt to these systems in order to make them reliable. We're sort of in a race with all the change in order to sort of lock them down and make them more secure. So I'll stop there. Really appreciate your time today. And I'll answer any questions that were in the chat as well. Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, there are a bunch of questions in the chat. If you want, I can help you.
Sure, I can. I'll scroll through. Yeah. So so the question asks, how do you perform ongoing evaluation of Scout? Do you have LMS judged behind it? So what I just described, right? I think you maybe asked that right before I went into that. But yeah, essentially we're creating this gold standard to assess the accuracy and completeness and relevance of the outputs, and then using that to generate a gold standard set, which we could use on an ongoing basis. And then we sort of test on a regular interval to make sure that the models continue to perform. And we're very rapidly developing the tool. So as we add new prompts or new tools, for the system to use, we need to reevaluate. And so we have this gold standard set. Okay, another question gets asked, from a quality perspective, do you ever use a human to spot check for accuracy? Yes, we do that all the time. So we have the structured study like I just showed you, but then on the back end, I actually have a dashboard of the logs that I look at every day to make sure that the system continues to perform. And so we do regular both human and other checks. The other thing is we also have the ability to leave feedback for users, although there's a whole host of issues with getting people to respond and so on and so forth. But anytime someone has an issue with it, it gets flagged. They have the ability to leave feedback and flag it, and we review every single one of those manually as a team. So we're doing our best to try to make sure we catch errors as they happen in real time. In terms of data input, so we are evaluating, of course, the tool's accuracy, but in terms of the data input, we have seen some issues where Scout will quote unquote make mistakes, but it's because the underlying documentation has a mistake. And so we're only as good as the documentation input, which again, I think Jim mentioned this is a very valid concern. We got this question about would a human spot check both the pass and the fail? So if we go back to here, this is more, it's going to depend on your use case, but I think in general, for simple use cases, or the main difference is that LLM evaluations can be done in an automatic way. In fact, if cost weren't an issue, I could continuously run evaluations on all of our products, just constantly. Every minute, I would just run an evaluation, right? Obviously, for cost issues, you can't do that, but even if you run it once a day or twice a day to make sure that it continues to work and the cost is reasonable, then you can continue to do that. And so we would envision that happens at a much higher frequency than a human spot check. Of course, the more human spot checks you can afford, the better. But certainly, if something fails beyond a certain threshold, that's where you want a human in the loop. Okay, Brian asks a great question here. It seems like one of your takeaways is that we really need to move beyond traditional A/B testing. You should know scoring is more challenging. We need better design systems that build upon the rubric-based reinforcement learning evaluation. How can we convince businesses to invest in the evaluation research and ongoing AI evaluation at a scalable level, specifically those looking for enterprise solutions? I think that's the main question here, right? So part of it, I think, is that there is a certain element of trust, I think, in vendors that people have. I hope, I don't know what I hope, but I've shown you that I think that's a little bit difficult to have, right? I mean, you really need to hope that your vendor, if they control the main endpoints, are doing these types of evaluations. It's an important question to ask. And so part of it, I think, for the purpose of today and also in general, is to educate on, what are the challenges with this type of evaluation and encouraging people when they work with third-party vendors or enterprise solutions that they are, asking the questions, hey, how are you handling automated evaluation? How do you handle when there's non-determinism, right? Asking point-blank questions so that you can be slightly more confident that the solutions being provided are actually accurate. So there's a whole, you can spend a whole talk talking about that question. And I think that is like the very important question that we have here.
Yeah. Can I also add to that question, Michael? Because
Yeah.
I think we think about that a lot in Health AI partnership too, when we work with other stakeholders and other health systems who are doing these implementation, right? I think the challenge is it's also about education of the health system leaders to understand what are the risks and harms and why there should be like these robust, rigorous evaluations, because especially with Gen AI, because these tools can be so simple on the front end that they solve your major problems, but in the back end, there could be a lot of complexities, and trying to make sure that people understand what kind of questions to ask when doing vendor assessments and what kind of responses to get back and how to interpret those responses, and getting that rigor in evaluations of vendor is another thing that we've been working on as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So a lot of it is education. Yeah.
I guess I'll continue on. I think Nandita asks, how would this work with a sort of AI inventory or lifecycle management? I think all of these tools can be integrated into whatever AI inventory cycles exist. We have regulatory bodies here at Duke that review these systems, and part of our registration with them is essentially saying, okay, here's how we're going to evaluate, here's how we created the gold standard data sets, and we receive iterative feedback on our approaches. And because this is a rapidly moving space, we actually are in contact with them, much more than we would be with maybe some other traditional AI models, because, like I said, these things change all the time, and we need to have, very specific plans in place to handle that. This is a great question from Leslie here. When commercial LLMs produce different results for the same prompt, how can we trust that any healthcare AI products are safe? This is a fantastic question. I think really, what it comes down to is if you want to make sure that the answer is going to be the same every time for the same prompt, you can't, right? Like I mentioned, it's effectively impossible. There are some ways you can try to do that. But I think the idea is not so much that the answer is generated the same every time, but that it has equal, sort of like, it's equal in terms of its accuracy, its completeness, and its safety. And so the best we can do is try to create these robust evaluation systems. But I think it's impossible to ignore that, although there are some potential safety and reliability concerns, there is a massive amount of value to be captured here, both from the health system perspective, as well from the patient perspective. people are going to use these tools. People ask ChatGPT about their health problem all the time. That's one of the like major uses that people have for it. And so I think the idea is that we can provide as many safeguards as we can while acknowledging the fact that these tools provide sort of outsized value and try to develop more techniques to stabilize them. Yeah, that's a great question. Scott, we will publish on this work with Scott. Certainly, look out for it in the next coming months. I think one of the questions here, have open models and open weights offered more transparency as evaluation? That's a great question. One of the challenges is that most health systems and hospitals, actually do not have their own hardware to run sort of the state-of-the-art open weight models. By open weight, this is referring to models that are sort of publicly available that you can run on commodity hardware. One of the issues, so part of your question is yes, open weight models can offer more transparency. And especially if you have your own hardware and you run it in like one example at a time, you actually can get some sense of determinism from the applications. The problem right now is that the difference in variation that you get from these closed source models is small enough that the additional performance benefits that you get from closed source models far outweighs sort of the determinism that you get from open weight models. And so right now, it's not really like these open weight models have caught up. I mean, maybe they have in some areas, but I can tell you as somebody who uses them every day, they're not quite there. If I'm building a system from scratch, I'm 100% going to stick with third-party APIs. And I would rather try to build a robust evaluation system to try to capture non-determinism rather than try to limit myself to open weight models on commodity hardware, which then the system has to manage. So that's just the trade-off that's being made all across the industry. Murad asked a question: when building an AI, do you consider these evaluations during the building process? Would this consider as bias or a proof check? Yeah, so I think when you're building AI, you have to consider these evaluations. It depends where in the stack you are. So I would say that the further down the stack you go, meaning the original model developers themselves, I mean, they care an insane amount about the evaluations because that's their whole product, right? So every large foundation company has internal evaluations. They have days where engineers who get paid $1 million a year get together in a room and they order pizza and they use their own product and they human evaluate all of their responses. There's well-known anecdotes of that happening. And so nobody is above sitting down and being the human and evaluate. I think that's a very, very key component. And the more at the frontier you are with these models, the more you realize that these evaluations are everything. In fact, that's sort of their secret sauce, I would say, is that they know exactly how to evaluate, how to generate these evaluations, because it determines how a better model gets made. How do you handle AI governance committee? Yeah, so like I said, Duke has very specific institution-wide regulatory bodies. We also have an IRB board, although they are more for approving like studies. This regulatory body is more for production capabilities, but it's difficult to constantly deal with the changing landscape and to inform everybody of what's happening. And so it's a very back and forth discussion rather than a top-down discussion. Helena asked, does Scout use off-the-shelf LLM models? Was it customized for a specific use case? So it uses third-party. We use we have a partnership with Microsoft, so we use Azure to host these models. We use a variety of models depending on the task that's being completed. You're only seeing like the end task where it generates the answer, but there's a lot of stuff happening beneath the hood, and we try to route different parts of it according to how complicated the task is for cost and speed reasons. So it's a little bit of a difficult question. Thank you, the Scout icon. Yes. Does the gold standard set ever degrade? Are there safeguards in place to ensure the set remains high quality? So I would say the gold standard set doesn't ever degrade because they're human generated, right? So it's only going to be as good as your human your human evaluation. One of the things that we've really struggled with is it's very tempting to use the large language models to generate a candidate gold standard set that you then human review. Because like I said, we have people sit down in these rooms, we order pizza, and like we hand label these things, right? But when you're labeling your 30th prior authorization note as a non-clinician and you don't even understand what any of the words mean, it's very tempting to just say, hey, let's just use a system that we built and then look at its answer because it's usually right, and then just modify that. But however, that's the only place where it degrades, right? There's a human fatigue factor in labeling these things that I think we need to take take ownership of. Okay, so I think we're almost out of time. If you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to the organizers, or you can email me directly, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Really appreciate all your time today, and hope you learned something.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Our next Health AI Partnership event, I posted the link for it. It's the AI in Action series. Topic is what patients think about AI in healthcare, insights from California focus groups. So I hope you will join us in October. Thank you. And the slides and the recording will be posted on Health AI Partnership website in coming days. Thank you.